He always took the last seat, not the second to last, not the end of the middle row, the very last pew in the very last row, pressed against the back wall of a church in Harlan, Kansas, as far from the front as a man could sit and still technically be inside. He had a system: arrive late, sit back, leave early, never speak first, never give anyone the opportunity to decide whether they were glad you were there or not. Marcus Webb had been running that system his entire life, and it had worked, until her. Clara Marsh was the kind of woman who noticed the things other people trained themselves not to see. The untouched coffee cup, the laugh that stopped just a little too fast, the man in the back row who always left before anyone could shake his hand. She noticed Marcus Webb the first Sunday he walked through that door, and here is the thing that would have undone him completely if he had known it. Every Sunday after that, before the service began, before a single word was spoken or a single hymn was sung, Clara looked for him first. 47 Sundays. She never once had to look twice. She always knew exactly where he was. He spent 11 months believing he was invisible. He was the most seen person in that room. If this is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends, the quiet kind, the kind about two people finding each other in the most ordinary place imaginable, go ahead and subscribe right now, because this channel is built for exactly that. And drop a comment below telling me whether you think a person can fall in love with someone they have never once spoken to. I want to know what you think before this story is over. Marcus Webb arrived in Harlan, Kansas on a Thursday in October of 1891, with a single trunk, a horse he had owned for 6 years, and the particular kind of quietness that does not come from shyness. It comes from loss, the kind of loss that happens slowly, over years, until one morning a man wakes up and realizes that every person who ever knew him by name is either dead or gone so far away they might as well be. And the world he is walking through now is full of strangers who will never know the first thing about who he was before it all fell apart. He was 38 years old. He had the hands of a man who had worked land his whole life, and the eyes of a man who had stopped expecting much from it. He rented a room above the grain supplier on Caldwell Street, took a job mending fences for a cattle operation 3 miles north of town, and on his very first Sunday in Harlan, almost without deciding to, he walked to the First Methodist Church, because it was the only building in town with its doors open, and light coming through the windows, and the sound of people inside. And Marcus Webb, who would have told you he needed none of those things, walked toward them anyway. He took the last pew. It was instinct by then, the same instinct that made him arrive after the singing started, and leave before the last amen. A man who has spent enough years on the outside of things develops a whole private architecture of self-protection, 100 small habits designed to make sure that if no one reaches out, it costs him nothing, because he never put himself close enough to be hurt by it. The last pew was part of that architecture. So was the timing. So was the way he kept his hat on his knee and his eyes forward, and never once turned to see who was sitting beside him. He was there and not there at the same time, which was exactly how he preferred it, and he was absolutely certain that no one in that church had the slightest idea he existed. He was wrong about that from the very first minute. Clara Marsh was 36 years old and had been leading the Women's Auxiliary of First Methodist for 4 years, which meant she knew every face in that congregation the way a shepherd knows every animal in the flock. Not just the names, but the moods, the absences, the ones who came in carrying something heavy that week, and the ones who left a little lighter than they arrived. She had a quality that certain people are born with, and almost no one can learn. The ability to walk into a room and feel its edges, to register without staring, to notice without making the noticed person feel like a subject. She had been this way her whole life. As a girl, it had made her seem strange. As a woman, it had made her indispensable. And on the first Sunday in October of 1891, she was standing at the front of the church, sorting hymnals, when the door at the back opened late, and a man she had never seen before slipped into the last pew, like a man who had been practicing how to take up as little space as possible. And something in Clara Marsh went very still and very alert, the way it did when she sensed something that deserved attention. She did not stare. She never stared. But she saw him. All of him. In the way she saw people, which was not the surface but the shape underneath the surface. She saw the careful lateness. She saw the last pew chosen with too much intention to be accidental. She saw the way he held his hat with both hands, not nervously, but the way a man holds the one thing he is sure belongs to him. And she understood, with the quiet certainty that came from a lifetime of reading people, that whoever this man was, he had not come to this church because he felt he belonged here. He had come because something in him was still reaching, still hoping, even after what looked like a very long time of having nothing reach back. She turned back to her hymnals. She did not say anything to anyone. But she had seen him, completely and without flinching. And that was already more than Marcus Webb had received from any room he had walked into in longer than he could remember. The following Sunday he came back, and the Sunday after that. By the 5th week it was clear he was not passing through. He was staying in Harlan. He was making this church part of his week the way a man makes something part of his week when it is giving him something he cannot get anywhere else, even if he could not have named what that something was. And every single Sunday, without exception, before Clara Marsh greeted a soul, before she opened her Bible, before she did a single thing that the morning required of her, she looked to the last pew on the left side to make sure he was there. She told herself it was the same attention she gave everyone. She told herself she would have noticed any newcomer this carefully. She told herself a great many things that were technically true and entirely beside the point. Because the truth was that by the 8th Sunday, she knew his schedule better than she knew some people she had sat beside for a decade. She knew he arrived 3 minutes after the opening hymn began. She knew he left during the final prayer, slipping out in the moment when every head was bowed and every eye was closed. She knew he never took a bulletin, never spoke to the pastor, never looked around the room to see if anyone was looking at him. He was the loneliest person in that building every single week. And he was working very hard to make sure nobody noticed. Nobody did. Nobody except her. And what Clara Marsh was beginning to feel about the man in the last pew was something she had not felt in so long that at first she did not even recognize it for what it was. It frightened her when she finally named it, not because it was unwelcome, but because Marcus Webb had the look of a man who had been hurt so far down that if she reached toward him wrong, if she moved too fast or said the wrong thing or made him feel cornered or pitied, he would disappear from that last pew and she would never see him again. And she could not bear that. She did not fully understand yet why she could not bear it. She only knew that on the Sundays she arrived early and the church was still empty. She found herself glancing at the last pew on the left side, at the indentation in the old cushion where he always sat, and feeling something she had no name for yet. She was still trying to find the name for it on the 47th Sunday. The morning everything changed. The morning Marcus Webb did not leave early. The morning he stayed until the room had nearly emptied, and then he stood up from the last pew, and he walked toward the front of the church with the look of a man who had been arguing with himself for a very long time, and had finally, at great cost, lost the argument. Clara saw him coming. Her heart did something it had no business doing, and she understood, in the moment before he reached her, that whatever he was about to say, her answer was already decided. What he said was not what she expected. Marcus Webb stood in front of Clara Marsh for the first time in 47 Sundays and said, "I owe you an apology." That was not what she had expected, not even close. She had imagined introductions, maybe a question about the congregation or the pastor or the town. She had imagined the small, cautious words that strangers use when they are testing whether a conversation is safe. She had not imagined an apology, and she had certainly not imagined the particular way he said it, not with embarrassment, not with the shuffling awkwardness of a man who did not know how to talk to a woman, but with the quiet directness of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times, alone in a rented room above a grain supplier on Caldwell Street, that he had burned away everything except the essential thing he needed to say. He looked at her the way people almost never look at each other, straight and still and without deflection, and he said, "Every Sunday I leave before it ends, before anyone can speak to me. I have been doing that for 11 months, and I know it is not the right way to be a guest in someone's house, even God's, so I am sorry for it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know why you do it." And the expression that crossed Marcus Webb's face in that instant was the expression of a man who has kept a door locked for so long he has forgotten there was ever anything behind it, and someone has just knocked on it anyway. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which Clara had already learned was his way, and she did not rush to fill the silence, which was her way. And for a moment they simply stood in the nearly empty church in Harlan, Kansas, while the last few congregants filed out around them, and the morning light came through the east window in long, flat bars across the floorboards, and something passed between them that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. Clara said, "My name is Clara Marsh. I have been watching you leave early for almost a year, and I have been hoping you would stop." Marcus said, "Marcus Webb." And then, because he was a man who had learned the hard way that honesty costs less in the long run than performance, he said, "I almost didn't stop today either." She said, "What made you?" He looked at the window, then back at her. He said, "I got tired of arguing with myself." Clara smiled, and it was the kind of smile that rearranges a room. And Marcus Webb, who had not made a woman smile in longer than he cared to count, felt something shift in his chest, like a stone moving after years of being still. They talked for 20 minutes in that empty church. 20 minutes that felt nothing like the careful, surface-level exchanges that strangers have when they are deciding whether to trust each other, and everything like a conversation between two people who had somehow, without ever speaking, already decided. He told her he had come from Western Missouri. He did not tell her why he had left, not yet, and she did not ask, because Clara Marsh understood instinctively that there is a kind of information that a person gives you when they are ready and not a moment before, and that pushing for it is the surest way to make sure you never receive it. She told him she had been in Harlan her whole life, that she had grown up 3 streets over, that she had left once for 2 years and come back because leaving had taught her that the place a person belongs has a way of making itself known through the specific quality of the ache you feel when you are away from it. Marcus listened to her the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, and she had the distinct and unusual sensation of being heard by someone who was actually hearing her, not waiting for his turn to speak, not half listening while composing his own response, but genuinely, quietly, all the way present. It was, she realized, the most heard she had felt in years. What neither of them said that morning, what sat unspoken in the space between them like a third person in the room, was that this conversation had been a long time coming. 11 months of shared Sunday mornings with not a single word exchanged. 11 months of her looking for him, and him never knowing she was looking. And now here they were, finally in the same moment at the same time, and the ease of it was almost disorienting, because it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a continuation of something that had already been going on quietly without either of them fully acknowledging it. Before he left that morning, Marcus asked if he might walk with her the following Sunday after the service. Not to dinner, not anywhere in particular, just walk. Clara said yes before the question was entirely finished, and she spent the rest of that day trying to convince herself that was not unusual, that she would have said yes that quickly to anyone, and failing completely to convince herself of anything of the sort. The following Sunday he sat in the last pew as always, arrived late as always, but this time he did not leave during the final prayer. He stayed, and Clara, standing at the front of the room, felt the specific relief of looking to the last pew on the left and seeing him still there when the last amen was spoken, as though some low-level anxiety she had been carrying for 11 months had finally been allowed to set itself down. They walked for an hour along the edge of town, where the road opened out toward the low hills, and the grass was the color of turned wheat, and the October sky was the kind of blue that makes the world look newly built. He talked more than she had expected, not nervously, not to fill space, but because he had things he had been carrying alone for a long time, and being next to someone who listened, the way Clara listened, had the effect of drawing words out of him that he had stopped believing he would ever say to anyone. He told her about Missouri, not all of it, but some of it. Enough. She listened without flinching, without offering the empty reassurances that people offer when they do not know what else to do with someone else's pain. She just listened, and when he was done, she said, "I'm glad you ended up in the last pew." He looked at her. He said, "So am I." And they walked back to town in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it at all. Over the weeks that followed, the walks became the thing they both arranged their Sundays around. The route grew longer each week, as though neither of them was in any hurry to arrive anywhere in particular. He began staying for the full service. He moved, without being asked and without drawing attention to it, from the last pew to the second to last, and then the week after that to the middle of the church. Each small movement forward so gradual that no one noticed except Clara, who noticed everything, and who understood that a man who has spent years making himself small does not suddenly take up space all at once. He takes it back, inch by inch, testing each new inch of ground before he trusts it with his weight. She never commented on it. She never pointed to it or praised him for it. She simply let him move at his own pace, and made sure that whatever pew he chose, when he looked up, she was not looking away. And then came the Sunday in December when he was not there at all. The last pew was empty. The second to last was empty. The middle of the church, where he had finally settled, was empty. Clara stood at the front of the room and looked at the space where Marcus Webb was supposed to be, and felt something cold move through her. that had nothing to do with the December air coming in under the door. She waited until the service ended. She waited until the church had emptied. And then she did something that she had never done for any person in 11 years of standing at the front of that congregation. She went looking for him. Now, before I tell you what she found, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever held back from someone out of fear, only to realize later they were waiting for you all along? Because what Clara was about to walk into on that December morning is going to stay with you. Write "never judge" in the comments if this story is speaking to you. I want to see how many of us are carrying the same thing. Clara Marsh was not a woman who acted on impulse. She was the kind of person who thought before she moved, who weighed things carefully, who understood that a hasty action taken from emotion could undo months of patient, careful work. But she walked out of that empty church on the first Sunday in December of 1891 and turned directly toward Caldwell Street without a moment of deliberation, because some things bypass the part of a person that weighs and calculates and go straight to the part that simply knows. And what Clara knew, with a certainty that frightened her a little, was that something was wrong. Marcus Webb had not missed a single Sunday in 11 months. Not through rain, not through the kind of bitter Kansas cold that kept half the congregation home, not through any of the ordinary reasons a person fails to show up. He had been there every week with the reliability of a man for whom that 1 hour in that one building was the fixed point around which the rest of his week quietly turned. And now he was not there. And the absence felt wrong the way a sound feels wrong when it stops suddenly in the middle of the night and you lie still in the dark trying to understand what the silence is telling you. She found him on the front step of the building on Caldwell Street, sitting on the wooden stoop in the December cold without a coat, his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging loose between them, staring at the frozen ground the way a man stares at something that is not in front of him at all, but somewhere deep inside him, where no one else can see. He did not hear her coming. She stopped a few feet away and said his name, quietly, the way you speak to someone you are not sure has fully come back from wherever they have gone. He looked up, and what she saw in his face in that unguarded moment, before he had the chance to arrange it into the composed, closed expression she had seen him wear for 11 months, stopped her completely. It was not sadness exactly. It was older than sadness. It was the face of a man who had been holding something enormous for so long that the holding had become indistinguishable from the man himself. And this morning, for whatever reason, the weight of it had simply become too much to carry to church. She sat down beside him on the cold step without being invited, and without asking if it was all right. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not offer him anything. She simply sat beside him in the December cold and let the silence be what it was, which was not empty but full of the 11 months behind them, and the 6 Sunday walks, and all the words he had given her carefully, one at a time, like a man rationing something he was not sure he could afford to run out of. They sat like that for a long time, long enough for the cold to move through her coat and settle into her shoulders. She did not shift or shiver or give any indication that she was uncomfortable, because the truth was that she would have sat on that step in a blizzard if that was what the moment required. And finally, without looking at her, Marcus said, "Today is the 7th of December." He said it the way you state a fact that is also a wound. Clara waited. He said, 7 years ago today I buried my wife and my son on the same day. Fever took them both inside a week. My boy was 4 years old. He stopped. The silence after those 2 sentences was the heaviest silence Clara had ever sat inside, and she did not try to fill it. She did not say she was sorry. Not yet. Not because she wasn't, but because sorry was too small a word for the space those sentences had opened up, and she refused to insult what he had just given her by reaching for the first word that came. What she did instead was the thing that Marcus Webb had never once received from anyone in 7 years of carrying this alone. She stayed. She did not stand up and say something kind and leave him to it. She did not redirect the conversation toward comfort or reassurance, or the practical business of getting him inside and warm. She stayed on that cold step beside him, and she let what he had said be exactly as heavy as it was, and she let him feel, perhaps for the first time since a fever took everything from him in Missouri in December of 1884, that the weight of it was being shared by someone who was not going to drop it, or hand it back, or pretend it was lighter than it was. After a while he said, "I couldn't go in today. I got to the door and I just couldn't." Clara said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, So I came out, and Marcus Webb, who had not wept in 7 years, because there had been no one to weep in front of, turned his face away, and was quiet for a long moment. And when he turned back, his eyes were red at the edges, and his jaw was set hard against it. And Clara looked at him with the same steady, unflinching attention she had given him from the very first Sunday, and did not look away. That was the day everything between them shifted from something unspoken into something real. Not because of what was said, but because of what was witnessed. A person can talk to you for months and still keep the most essential part of themselves behind a locked door. But when someone sees you at the bottom of your worst day, sitting coatless on a frozen step with 7 years of grief on your face and nowhere left to hide it, and they sit down beside you anyway, and they do not flinch, and they do not leave, that is when a door opens that does not close again. Marcus Webb had built his whole life in Harlan around not being seen that deeply by anyone, and Clara Marsh had walked straight through every wall he had ever built, not by force, not by persistence, but simply by being the kind of person who stays. He let her in that day, slowly, the way he did everything, but truly. Over the weeks that followed, the Sunday walks became longer, and the silences between them became the comfortable kind that only exist between people who have stopped performing for each other. He told her the rest of Missouri, all of it this time, and she received it the way she received everything he gave her, carefully, completely, without judgment. She told him things in return that she had not told anyone. The 2 years she had left Harlan, and what she had been running from, and why she had come back. The particular loneliness of being a woman who sees people clearly, in a town that has long since decided it already knows who she is. He listened the way she had listened to him, all the way down, without interruption, and she had the sensation she had first felt in that empty church on the 47th Sunday, of being heard by someone who was genuinely, entirely there. They were, without either of them formally declaring it, becoming the most important person in each other's life, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so yet, because some things are too important to rush, and both of them had learned that lesson the hard way. And then in the last week of January, Clara arrived at church on Sunday morning, and found something on the front pew. Not the last pew, not the second to last, the very first pew, the one closest to the front of the church, the one that in 11 months of Sundays Marcus Webb would have considered as distant and unreachable as the moon. On the seat was a single folded piece of paper with her name on it, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had taught himself to mean every word he put down. She looked around the church. He was not there yet. She picked up the paper. She opened it, and what was written inside was so simple and so completely, devastatingly honest, that she had to sit down on that front pew and read it twice before she trusted herself to believe that a man had actually written it. She was still sitting there, holding the paper with both hands, when the door at the back of the church opened, and she heard his boots on the floorboards coming toward her, not toward the last pew, not toward the back of the room, but straight down the center aisle, all the way to the front, where she was waiting. The note had 7 words on it, that was all. 7 words in Marcus Webb's careful, deliberate hand, each letter formed with the kind of attention a man gives to something he has rewritten a dozen times, and finally decided to leave simple, because simple was the only thing honest enough. Clara read it twice sitting on that front pew with the January light coming thin and pale through the east window, and her hands not entirely steady. The 7 words were, "I would like to stop leaving early." That was it. No declaration, no poetry, no flourish. Just 7 words from a man who had spent 11 months perfecting the art of departure, telling the one person who had ever made him want to stay that he was done practicing how to leave. Clara sat with those words for a long moment, and then she folded the paper very carefully along its original crease, and held it in her lap, and looked up at the empty church around her, and understood that she was not going to be the same person she had been when she walked through that door this morning. Some things rearrange you. Some things come in so quietly, and land so precisely in the exact place you did not know was waiting for them, that by the time you feel it, the rearranging is already done. She heard the door open. She heard his boots on the floorboards, and she did not turn around. She kept her eyes forward the way Marcus had kept his eyes forward for 11 months in the last pew, and she listened to him walk the full length of that church, down the center aisle, all the way to the front, and stop beside the pew where she was sitting. He did not sit down immediately. He stood there for a moment, this man who had made a system out of distance and a habit out of disappearing, standing at the very front of the room that had once been too exposed for him to come within 10 rows of, and Clara could feel the courage that had cost him without him saying a single word about it. She moved over on the pew. He sat down beside her. They were quiet for a moment. Then Clara said, 7 words. Marcus said, "I couldn't think of fewer that would say it." She looked at him. She said, "You couldn't have said it with fewer." He looked back at her, and something in his expression was different from anything she had seen on his face before. Not closed, not careful, not arranged into the composed distance he had worn like a second coat for as long as she had known him. He looked, for the first time, like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time, and was still slightly surprised to find his hands empty. The service happened around them that morning the way weather happens, present and real, but somehow beside the point. Clara sat in the front pew beside Marcus Webb, and for the first time in 11 months, she did not look to the back of the church to find him, because he was right there beside her, and the relief of that was so complete and so quiet that it felt less like a new thing and more like the resolution of something that had been unfinished for almost a year. After the service, when the congregation filtered out and the pastor shook hands at the door, and the building emptied back into its weekly silence, Marcus and Clara remained sitting in the front pew, not because they had things to say, but because neither of them was in any hurry to leave a moment they had both, in their own private ways, been moving towards since the first Sunday in October of 1891, when a man who had perfected the art of invisibility walked through a door and was immediately, completely, irrevocably seen. He asked her that morning if she would allow him to call on her properly. Not a walk, not a chance conversation after a service, but properly, with intention, the way a man calls on a woman when he is no longer pretending to himself that what he feels is casual or incidental, or something he can manage at a comfortable distance. Clara said yes, and then she said something that she had been holding for 11 months, something she had told herself she would never say because it was too much and too revealing, and would give him too clear a view of exactly how closely she had been paying attention. She said, "Marcus, I want you to know something. Every single Sunday for 11 months, before I did anything else, before I spoke to a soul or opened my Bible, or thought about a single thing the morning required of me, I looked for you first. You were never invisible. Not to me. Not once. Not from the very first night." Marcus Webb was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Clara wondered if she had said too much, moved too fast, handed him something he wasn't ready to hold. And then he said, in the low, careful voice that she had come to understand was the voice he used when something mattered enough to be said exactly right, "I felt it. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it every Sunday like something warm in a cold room. I just didn't know anyone was allowed to feel that way about me anymore." And Clara, who had spent a lifetime noticing things that other people missed, understood that what Marcus Webb had just given her was the most honest sentence she had ever received from another human being. He called on her the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The Sunday walks continued, but they were different now, unguarded in a way they had not quite been before, the conversation ranging further, and the silences between them easier, and the distance between them on the road somehow shorter each week, without either of them consciously deciding to close it. He met her at the bakery on Wednesday mornings when she picked up bread for the auxiliary, and he began staying for coffee, and the woman who ran the bakery told her sister, who told half of Harlan, that Clara Marsh and the quiet man from Caldwell Street sat at the corner table every Wednesday for an hour and talked the way people talk when they are no longer being careful, which is to say, like people who have decided to trust each other with the real version of themselves and are discovering, with some relief and some wonder, that the real version is exactly what the other person wanted all along. The town noticed. The town always notices, but Marcus and Clara had both long since stopped arranging their lives around what Harlan thought, which was one of the many things they had quietly in common. He proposed in April, on a Sunday, after the service, in the church, not in the last pew, not in the back of the room. He proposed at the front, standing in the same spot where he had walked to on that January morning, with 7 words folded in his coat pocket, and a lifetime of practiced leaving that he had finally decided to unlearn. He did not have a speech. He was not a man who dealt in speeches. He said, "Clara, I came to this church 11 months ago, not knowing a single person in this town, and I sat in the back row because I had forgotten that I was allowed to be anywhere else. You remembered it for me. You saw me when I was doing everything I could think of not to be seen, and you looked anyway, and you didn't look away. I don't have the right words for what that did to me. I just know that I would like to spend the rest of my life sitting in the front pew." Clara said yes, and then she said, "You have been sitting in the front pew since January." And Marcus Webb, who had not laughed easily in 7 years, laughed, and the sound of it filled that church from the front pew all the way to the empty last pew in the back left corner, and Clara thought it was the finest thing she had ever heard in that building, including every hymn in 11 months of Sundays. They were married in June of 1892 in the First Methodist Church of Harlan, Kansas. Marcus Webb, who had arrived in that town with a trunk and a horse, and the particular quietness of a man who has lost everything that ever knew his name, stood at the front of the church he had spent 11 months trying to disappear in, and waited for the woman who had never once let him disappear. Clara kept the note, 7 words on a folded piece of paper, slightly worn at the crease from being opened and refolded over the years. She kept it in the front of her Bible, which was where she kept the things that had changed her life, and she would sometimes take it out on Sunday mornings before the service began, and read those 7 words, and remember the January morning she had sat in the front pew with the pale winter light coming through the east window, and heard his boots coming toward her down the center aisle for the very first time, and understood that the man who had spent 11 months perfecting how to leave had finally, completely, and without reservation, decided to stay. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the quietest love is sometimes the most lasting, that being truly seen by one person is worth more than being admired by 1,000, that it is never too late to stop leaving early and walk all the way to the front, then subscribe to this channel right now, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories of ordinary people who loved each other in extraordinary ways. We tell the quiet ones, the earned ones, the ones that take 11 months of Sundays and 7 words, and one person who refuses to look away. If you found this channel today and this story is the first one you heard, you are in the right place. And if you have been here a while, you already know that the next story is going to stay with you just as long. Subscribe and come back next time, because there are more people worth finding in the back row, and we are just getting started.